Okay, so one of the other things that's really important to know is that drugs are going to vary in their effectiveness based on their site of action and their affinity for those sites of action. So some drugs may actually have a greater affinity for binding sites than others, and that makes them more potent or more effective. So compare something like codeine, which you might get in a cough syrup, to something like morphine. Both of those will bind to opioid receptors, but morphine is going to bind with a greater affinity, and hence it's going to be more potent. So one of the ways that we can actually assess how effective a drug is by looking at a dose response curve. So what you're looking at here is the dose response curve for morphine. Morphine has a lot of different effects, but two big ones that are desired effects are analgesia, which is pain relieving, and sedation on the brainstem. Now, each of those is going to have its own dose response curve. It doesn't take a lot of morphine to produce an analgesic or pain relieving effect. At a certain point, because all of those receptors get saturated and the dose level is basically going to reach an asymptote. Basically, at that point, there's no further binding that can occur. The problem is, at the same time, as you increase the dose of the drug, morphine will also affect respiration due to binding in the brainstem. And so what this means is that the higher the dose, the greater the likelihood that you inhibit respiration. And so that's a very dangerous effect. And so the effect between our desired effect and the unwanted side effects that can be dangerous is what is known as the margin of safety. The ideal drug is one that has a large margin of safety so that we can give it to people without harmful side effects. One of the other ways that we can actually look at the margin of safety is by a measure known as a therapeutic index. That is going to be available for drugs that have been tested in a lab. As a general rule, a therapeutic index is a ratio of a lethal dose relative to a therapeutic dose. So generally, the larger the number, the greater the amount of drug that would have to be taken to be lethal relative to its therapeutic number. Higher values indicate a safer drug. Lower numbers indicate a more dangerous drug. So for example, aspirin, you can die from taking too much aspirin. An overdose will kill you, but it would take hundreds of pills to do that. In contrast, something like alcohol and morphine have therapeutic indices below around 10 or lower. And this means that it takes about 10 times as much to kill you than it does to make you feel intoxicated. The lower the drug, the therapeutic index, the more likely a drug is to be a controlled substance like morphine or a banned substance like heroin. So something that really seems to be evident is that addiction for many types of drugs is associated with the Mesolimbic Pathway. And you can actually read more about this in pages 384 to 386 in your book. These drugs do differ in the particular neurotransmitters they act upon, but they do all seem to have an effect on the reward circuit of the brain. So this is the mesolimbic pathway. It connects the ventral tegmental area of the midbrain to the nucleus accumbens in the limbic system. The ventral tegmental neurons are dopaminergic. They send output to the nucleus accumbens. This pathway is one of the most important ones in addiction. These pathways mediate things like motivation, libido, eating, pleasure-seeking behavior. Drugs with addictive potential basically are going to hijack these circuits and produce abnormal levels of activity. So for example, researchers actually did an imaging study looking at activity in the nucleus accumbens while people who were either smokers or non-smokers viewed smoking-related images. As you can kind of see in this figure, obviously there is some variability within groups, but in general, smokers showed higher rates of activation relative to non-smokers. This suggests that these images, which enhance the sense of craving for nicotine, activate the reward circuitry of the brain to a greater extent in addicted individuals. Kind of related to this finding is the finding that in the resting state, when people aren't doing anything, the level of activity in the reward circuit is inversely proportional to the amount of cocaine consumed on a weekly basis. So what you're looking at here is activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a part of the mesocortical pathway, versus cocaine consumption. In general, the more cocaine that you consume, the lower the activity in this region. They also do have reduced volume. So drug abuse causes changes in the reward circuits of the brain. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different drugs of abuse, and we're going to start by talking about our opiates or opioids. So opiates have many different effects due to the relatively diffuse distribution of receptors and the function on those regions where receptors are located. Opiates are powerful analgesics. They kill pain. That is what they are largely prescribed for. This action is mediated by binding of opiates in the midbrain and the spinal cord, where pain signals that come from the body are basically shut off before they reach the somatosensory cortex, where they'd be consciously felt. Opiates do have anxiolytic properties. This means they reduce anxiety. This function is mediated by binding of opiates in the medial frontal cortex and in the amygdala. These regions are going to be really important for emotion, fear, and stress. They are also cough suppressants. They bind to respiration centers in the medulla and reduce that activity. By slowing down activity in the medulla, it is an effective cough medicine. It's one of the best ones there is. It's part of the reason why you occasionally get cough syrup with codeine in it, but you have to have a prescription. The effect in this area can be dangerous because if the dose is too great, respiration can slow to the point of death. So we have to really highly regulate cough suppressants that contain those opioids. Most contemporary cough medicines have opium derivatives, but in many cases, if you're getting one with an opium derivative, it's by prescription. They also have a profound effect of sedation, and this will produce a dreamlike state. You might have had to take these for different types of surgeries, and that's basically mediated by binding in the brainstem and the hypothalamus. Okay. So if you want to see where these opioid receptors are located, here red, yellow, and orange show areas where we have the greatest concentration of receptors. The thalamus and the hypothalamus have very high concentrations. Parts of the medial frontal cortex, like the limbic system, also mediate those effects, and you'll also kind of notice that there's a pretty good concentration in the midbrain. This kind of looks like a certain pathway that I think we've seen before. Can you also notice that? I do. It looks like the Mesolimbic Pathway in this particular case. So opioid receptors are concentrated largely in the midbrain, and that binding basically stimulates the reward pathway. So let's talk about some of these different side effects. Obviously, respiratory suppression is pretty dangerous. We want to be careful with that. Addiction is also another possibility. So there are a few well-publicized drugs that directly affect opioid receptors. So we have natural ones that occur in the opium poppy itself. That includes morphine and codeine. We also have synthetic or semi-synthetic ones. That includes diacetyl morphine, better known as heroin, hydrocodone, known as Vicodin, and oxycodone, better known as Oxycontin. These are largely addictive because they cross the blood-brain barrier more than up to 3 times more efficiently. They are more lipid soluble, and that makes them cross much more easily. All of these drugs bind to opioid receptors. So here is the poppy plant that opium is derived from, Papaver somnifera. And so here's how it tends to be harvested. The petals will fall off from the stem of the flower, and then you have what's inside of the pod. If it's allowed to dry, that's how we get poppy seeds, and you can actually eat those. Generally, while these pods are still green, you take a knife, you make a slit in it, and this gooey substance oozes out, and that produces opium. It's collected by hand. The two of the active ingredients in this goo are morphine and codeine. And they come from the opium poppy, so we call them opiates. The word opium comes from the Greek word opos, which means juice or sap. Generally, all of the morphine that is used in modern medicine all over the world comes from small numbers of factories, like in Pakistan. It also comes from India and Turkey. India and Turkey account for most of the world's legal opium production, and Afghanistan is responsible for most of the world's illegal production. So as the goo oxidizes, when it's left out to dry, it actually darkens. It can be cooked to evaporate some of the water to actually concentrate the more active components. And this will further darken it, and you get this substance, as you can see here, referred to as black tar or opium tar. Generally, opioids can get into the body in a number of different ways. You can take it in an oral or digestive route. That's the one that's been used historically. Thousands of years ago, people would just chop up the seed pods and eat them or put them in water before they discovered that they could actually just cut the pod and wait for the goo to come out. Another way that people have tried to concentrate it is by making a tincture or an alcohol extract. So you combine alcohol and opium to develop something known as laudanum. This has been used and written about since the 16th century. It really isn't used that much today. Another form is inhalation by smoking opium. And then finally, it can be snorted in a powdered form or injected into veins. So heroin is what is called a semi-synthetic opiate. It's derived from morphine. So here's something you may not know. It wasn't created by a street dealer. It was actually created by the Bayer Company in the 1890s. It went on the market under the brand name Heroin, advertising as a cough medicine. They thought that because they could use less of it per dose, it'd have fewer side effects than opium. Unfortunately, what they created was 2 times as potent per dose. Heroin is an example of something that was on the market for a few years as a cough medicine. It was legally advertised, and it wasn't around for very long. It was withdrawn around the 1920s, like 1916 to 1920, around the Harrison Act. It was basically made illegal. It's now only produced on the black market. It's sold primarily as a white or yellow powder. It's typically mixed with water, heated, and injected, so it can be snorted or smoked. The reason that it's more addictive than other opiates is because it's fat soluble. It crosses the blood-brain barrier much more quickly, and that makes it more addictive. Vicodin and OxyContin are 2 other types of synthetic opioids. They're not as addictive as heroin due to the way that they're administered. They're orally taken. They do not cross the blood-brain barrier as effectively. So repeated use of heroin results in a number of physiological changes. We are going to see fewer opioid receptors. That's going to lead to tolerance, and this is part of that physical dependence. As your body gets used to the opioids, it's going to cut the number of opioid receptors. That produces tolerance and wanting to take more of a drug to reach a high. This is going to lead to a greater risk of toxicity, and typically what we will find is the more that you take, the greater the likelihood that you take a dose that basically makes you stop breathing. The therapeutic index of opiates are pretty low. There's not a large margin between the therapeutic and lethal dose. Too many opioids will produce respiration depression, so you will basically stop breathing. So generally, the user will take more and more, getting to that lethal dose. Your liver will also become better at breaking it down. Because the therapeutic index is not that high, it only takes a little more to actually be fatal. In terms of reuptake and breakdown, that is also going to affect that. So as you have fewer receptors, what we will find is that less of that drug can bind. I will briefly talk about tolerance and overdose and recovery in just a few minutes.